Beloved, for more than 2,000 years, humanity has lived under the weight of a profound misunderstanding, an expectation that has shaped religions, divided nations, and filled hearts with both hope and fear. It is the belief that the second coming of Christ is a future event, a moment of divine intervention, an appearance in time and space when a figure will descend from the heavens to restore order to a suffering world. And so generation after generation has watched the sky, predicting dates, calculating signs, reading omens, waiting for something to take place out there that would somehow redeem what feels lost in here. But nothing could be further from the truth. The kingdom of God, we are told, is within you, not above you, not beyond you, not waiting to arrive, but silently present, eternally complete, at the center of your very being. And yet this simple truth has been overlooked because the human mind has always sought God in form, in personality, in phenomena. Humanity has longed for an outer savior, forgetting that the only salvation possible is the discovery of one's own divine identity. This is the misunderstanding of the ages, that Christ is a person and not a presence, that Christ must return when in truth Christ never left, that Christ must arrive, when Christ has always been the life of your life, the breath of your breath, the consciousness of your consciousness. For centuries the world has projected its longing outward. It has believed the Messiah must appear in robes or in radiant glory. It has believed that salvation must come through some historical intervention. But the teaching of the Christ, the teaching revealed through the life of Jesus and illumined by every true mystic, is that God is closer than breath, nearer than hands and feet, and that the divine manifestation we call Christ is the eternal spiritual identity of every soul. The fear that has grown around the second coming originated the moment we imagined it as an external judgment, an upheaval of nature, or a cosmic reckoning. But fear always arises from the belief in separation. The moment you believe God is a distant deity who must return to you, you have already accepted the premise that you are apart from the source of your being. And from that mistaken premise flows every form of anxiety, anticipation, and confusion. The spiritual truth is this: the second coming is not the return of a man, but the awakening of a consciousness. It is not an event, but a realization. It is not something to wait for, but something to recognize. The Christ is not coming to you. The Christ is coming through you. As the dawning of your own awareness of oneness, when Jesus walked the earth, he walked as one who had awakened to that inner truth. He said, "I and the Father are one," not to elevate himself above humanity, but to reveal what is true of all creation. The world has revered the messenger and forgotten the message. It has worshipped the vessel and overlooked the life that animated it. And so the teaching that could have freed humanity from centuries of fear was misunderstood, misinterpreted, and externalized. Today, we begin to correct that misunderstanding. Not through argument, not through theology, but through quiet recognition. For the Christ that the world awaits is already present. The light that humanity believes must descend from heaven is already shining within. And the second coming, this great event foretold in Scripture, prophesied by mystics, debated by scholars, is nothing more and nothing less than your own inner awakening to the presence of God as your own true self. Let us, in this hour, lay aside the world's expectations and return to the simplicity of spiritual truth. Let us see the second coming not as a cosmic disturbance, but as the still, small voice breaking through the noise of human belief. Let us recognize that the Savior does not come from the sky, but from the silence within. And let us open ourselves to the possibility that what the world has awaited for millennia may unfold in the quiet chambers of our own consciousness even now. This is the introduction to our journey. From here, we will begin to explore why humanity has looked outward for what can only be found inward, and how this inner realization marks the beginning of the true second coming. For countless generations, humanity has searched for God where God could never be found outside itself. This outward search is not a failure of devotion, but a natural stage of spiritual infancy. When the capacity for inner perception has not yet awakened, one looks to forms, to symbols, to the tangible and visible, believing that God must reveal himself in the same way that all other things appear, as matter, as movement, as external event. And so humanity built temples, erected altars, created rituals, and appointed intermediaries, not because these things contained God, but because they provided a point of focus for minds, not yet still enough to perceive the invisible presence. In this way, organized religion served its purpose. It guided the gaze of the seeker upward and outward, teaching reverence, teaching aspiration. Yet it could never teach the one lesson that only an awakened consciousness can learn, that God is not reached by stretching outward, but by sinking inward. Throughout history, the masses expected divinity to come in visible form because visibility was the only language they understood. When consciousness is unawakened, it cannot imagine an invisible kingdom, so it imagines an external Messiah. When the heart has not discovered its divine center, it imagines a God who lives elsewhere. When spiritual perception is dim, it seeks light not within but in the sky, believing that salvation must descend from above rather than rise from the depth of one's own being. This explains why humanity has clung so tightly to the idea of a coming one, a savior arriving in a moment of cosmic intervention. It is not that people are misguided. It is that people have not yet realized the nature of spiritual reality. They believe the world they see with the eyes is the world in which God must act. They believe the events of history determine the events of spirit. And so they wait, watching, interpreting, speculating on signs and wonders that could never reveal what must be known only in the stillness of consciousness. Every age has repeated this pattern. The early Hebrew prophets foretold a Messiah who would liberate Israel from earthly oppression. When Jesus appeared, many rejected him because he did not fulfill the external expectations they had cherished. They wanted a warrior, a king, a visible triumph. They could not imagine that the true Messiah had come not to change the conditions of the outer world, but to reveal the presence of the inner kingdom. And so it has continued through centuries of Christian history. The Church, unable to perceive the mystical dimension of the Christ teaching, externalized the second coming just as earlier generations had externalized the first. Instead of seeing the Christ as the divine selfhood of all, it taught that only one individual embodied this light, and that humanity must wait for that individual to return. In this way, the world perpetuated its own blindness. It searched for the Christ in flesh while ignoring the Christ in consciousness. It worshipped the historical Jesus while overlooking the eternal spirit that animated him. It built doctrines about a distant future event while missing the immediacy of the present spiritual reality. Goldsmith often pointed out that the human mind clings to form because form seems dependable, definable, controllable. But God is none of these. God cannot be confined to a form, cannot be contained in a doctrine, cannot be captured in an expectation. The divine presence is infinite, incorporeal, ever-present, and therefore must be realized, not awaited. This is why humanity has looked outward, because outward is all it knew. And this is why the masses still wait for a Messiah to appear in the clouds, unaware that the true appearing of Christ is the dawning of spiritual awareness within their own hearts. As long as God is sought externally, the second coming remains a future hope rather than a present realization. But the moment you turn from the world, from signs, from predictions, from external events, and direct your attention inward, you discover what the early disciples discovered in the silence after Jesus' departure, that the Christ never goes, never comes, but simply reveals its eternal presence. This understanding forms the foundation for everything that follows. To see why the second coming is not an event in time but an awakening in consciousness, we must first recognize how deeply humanity has relied on outward interpretations. Only then can we begin to shift from expectation to realization, from looking outward to perceiving inward, from waiting for the Christ to appear to discovering that Christ is and always has been the very life within us. And now, beloved, we come to the heart of the mystery, the point where human expectation dissolves into spiritual revelation. For if the world has long looked outward for a returning Christ, we must ask, what was it that Jesus himself intended us to understand? What did he reveal through his life, not in words alone, but in the consciousness from which those words arose? The answer is simple, yet it overturns centuries of misunderstanding. The second coming is not the return of a person, it is the awakening of the Christ within you. When Jesus spoke, he spoke from the awareness that his identity was not limited to a Hebrew man born in Bethlehem. He spoke from the realization of the Christ, the divine sonship, the living presence of God expressing itself as individual being. And when he said, "I am the way," he did not mean that his human personality was the way. He meant the I am, the divine identity at the center of every soul, is the way, the truth, and the life. Never once did he claim that this consciousness belonged to him alone. Never once did he imply that others should await his return in a body. Instead, he said, "The works that I do, ye shall do also." He said, "The kingdom of God is within you." He said, "Lo, I am with you always." These were not the promises of a man planning to return in the future. They were the declarations of a spiritual reality available to all who awaken to it. Joel Goldsmith understood this with a clarity rare in the world. He taught that Christ is not a person, but a state of consciousness God realized as the true identity of the individual. Jesus was the embodiment of that consciousness, the demonstration of what it looks like when a human being lives in perpetual oneness with the infinite. But what he demonstrated was not an exception. It was a revelation of what is true of every soul. Therefore, the second coming is not the reappearance of Jesus in the flesh. The flesh could add nothing to your salvation. The second coming is the moment when you awaken to the same consciousness that animated him, the moment when you too can say, "I and the Father are one," not as a statement of pride, but as a recognition of truth. This is what Goldsmith called the inner christing, the dawning of spiritual identity, the recognition that the life within you is not separate from the life of God. It is not a human achievement. It is not the result of study or discipline. It is a divine revelation that arises when the mind becomes still enough to perceive what has always been. For the Christ does not come from without. It unfolds from within, like a flower blooming in the warmth of the sun. It does not enter you. It reveals itself as your own essence. It does not arrive in time. It is eternally present, waiting only for your recognition. This is why Jesus said, "Before Abraham was, I am." He was not referring to the birth of the man Jesus, but to the timeless nature of the Christ presence, the indwelling I that has no beginning and no end. To look for Christ to return in the sky is to continue believing in separation. To wait for a future event is to deny the ever-present reality that stands before you now, whispering, Here I am. The second coming is the awakening of this whisper, the unveiling of this presence, the moment when the veil of personal identity dissolves and the truth of your being shines forth. Goldsmith reminded us again and again, the Christ is the divine activity of your consciousness. It is the presence that heals, that guides, that illumines, that sustains. When you recognize this, even faintly, you have touched the beginning of the second coming. When the sense of separation begins to fade, the second coming has begun in you. When fear loses its authority and inner peace becomes your dwelling place, the second coming is unfolding. When you no longer seek God through effort, but realize God as the very foundation of your existence, the Christ has come. And so we say, not as metaphor, but as spiritual fact. The second coming is the unveiling of your true identity. It is not an external event. It is the awakening of God consciousness within the temple of your own being. This is the revelation Jesus lived, the revelation he imparted, and the revelation Goldsmith labored to restore to its rightful place in the hearts of seekers. Let us, therefore, set aside the notion of a returning figure and turn our attention inward where the true coming takes place. Let us be still enough to recognize that the Christ we await is the Christ we already are, and let us prepare our consciousness to receive that holy realization. And now, beloved, we come to the sacred moment when the veil begins to lift, not because something new is entering your life, but because something ancient is being remembered. The world speaks of the second coming as an arrival, but in truth, spiritual realization is always an unveiling. Nothing descends, nothing travels, nothing appears from beyond. Rather, the mists of human belief dissolve, and you behold what has always been true. The Christ does not come to you. The Christ is revealed within you. It does not enter the heart. It becomes visible to the heart. It does not begin to exist when you awaken. You awaken to the fact that it has never ceased to be. You see, the divine presence is like the sun hidden behind clouds. The sun does not move. The clouds simply disperse. So it is with the Christ. You have never been separate, never been incomplete, never been outside the kingdom. But the clouds of belief, belief in personal identity, belief in two powers, belief in separation, belief in material existence as reality have obscured the light. And the moment these clouds thin, even slightly, a radiance begins to appear that is not of this world. This unveiling often begins quietly. There is no announcement, no trumpet, no flash of spiritual fireworks. It may begin as a subtle shift in your awareness, a softness in your breath, a gentle sense that all is well despite appearances. You may not even recognize it at first, because the Christ does not come with drama, it comes with peace. It speaks not with thunder, but with stillness. It reveals itself not in words, but in presence. Joel Goldsmith often said that spiritual awakening is the moment you realize you have been looking at life through a window clouded by centuries of human belief. As the window clears, you do not see a different world. You see the same world differently. What once appeared as lack, you now behold as fullness. What once appeared as conflict, you now perceive as illusion. What once appeared as sickness, you now sense as a misinterpretation of the divine perfection that is always present. This is the unveiling, the recognition that reality was never what your senses told you. There is a world of spirit, a world of divine harmony, a world of infinite completeness. And it is here, now, in this very moment. It has been here your entire life, but only through the dawning of inner awareness can you perceive it. When Jesus said, "Having eyes ye see not, and having ears ye hear not. He was not chastising humanity. He was describing the condition of unawakened consciousness, which fails to see spiritual truth because it has been trained to trust only what the senses report. When the Christ unveils itself within you, you begin to see with spiritual vision. You begin to hear the guidance of the inner presence. You begin to feel the quiet assurance that the world of appearances is not the world of reality. This unveiling is the second coming taking place in the depth of your consciousness. It is not a moment of emotional excitement. It is not the climax of spiritual effort. It is the gentle awareness that you are no longer looking at life through the lens of personality, but through the Christ mind. You begin to understand that your life is not separate from God's life, that your being is not separate from God's being, that your consciousness is the individualized expression of the infinite consciousness that we call God. When this awareness dawns, even faintly, the world begins to change, not because the outer conditions shift immediately, but because your perception shifts. You no longer identify yourself as a struggling mortal trying to reach a distant God. You begin to recognize yourself as the temple of the living God, the place where the Christ reveals itself, the transparency through which divine life shines. You may find that old fears lose their authority. Old habits of worry no longer hold you. Old patterns of seeking, striving, and searching begin to dissolve. You rest more frequently in silence. You move more gently. You act from peace rather than panic. You listen inwardly before responding outwardly. These are the fruits of the unveiling, and gradually, the presence that once felt subtle begins to feel natural. The inner Christ, once glimpsed occasionally, becomes the atmosphere in which you live. This is how the second coming unfolds, not as a single moment, but as a continuous opening, a daily dawning, an ever-expanding recognition of the one life, expressing itself as your very own being. This unveiling is available to every soul because the Christ is not bestowed. It is revealed, it is not earned, it is recognized. And in this recognition, you discover the profound truth. The Christ was never absent. The only thing that was absent was your awareness of it. Let us hold this recognition gently as we proceed, for the unveiling is not complete until every sense of separation dissolves, and this prepares us for the next stage of our journey. Beloved, whenever humanity misunderstands spiritual truth, fear is the inevitable result. And few teachings have been as misunderstood or surrounded with as much apprehension as the second coming. For centuries, people have trembled at the thought of judgment, of endings, of upheaval. They have imagined cosmic disasters, divine wrath, the shaking of the world, the collapse of all that seems familiar. But these fears arise not from truth, but from the belief that God is separate from us, and that his appearing must therefore come as a disturbance to our lives instead of a revelation of our true nature. Fear always belongs to the realm of separation. Every fear you have ever known, fear of illness, fear of lack, fear of death, fear of failure, has arisen because you believed yourself to be a self apart from God. The ego self trembles because it knows its existence is unstable, temporary, uncertain. It imagines that life is a struggle for survival, and therefore it anticipates danger. When people project this fear onto the idea of the second coming, they paint a picture of divine intrusion rather than divine unveiling. But when you understand that the Christ is the very essence of your being, you realize there is nothing to fear. How could you fear the appearing of your own true self? How could you dread the coming of the very presence that sustains you, breathes you, loves you? The only thing that fears the Christ is the false sense of self, the ego, and it fears not because Christ threatens it, but because Christ reveals it to be an illusion. This is the root of the misunderstanding. The second coming is not the end of the world. It is the end of the false world you have carried in your mind, the world of fear, separation, and limitation. The world that dissolves in the presence of Christ is not the physical earth, but the mental realm of mistaken identity. And so, when people hear that the second coming will be the end of the world, they shrink back in terror, never realizing that what ends is the world of illusion, not the world of reality. Consider this. When light enters a dark room, the darkness disappears, but nothing destructive has occurred. Darkness has no substance. It is merely the absence of light. When Christ consciousness dawns, the darkness of fear disappears in the same effortless way. Nothing collapses. Nothing is punished. Nothing is destroyed. Illusion simply yields to truth. Yet because humanity has believed that God is something other than the very life within them, the coming of Christ has been imagined as an invasion rather than a revelation. When God is perceived as external, his appearing seems threatening. When Christ is seen as other, his return feels like judgment. But once you understand that the Christ is the divine identity of your own being, the whole emotional atmosphere shifts. What once seemed fearful becomes deeply comforting. What once seemed threatening becomes liberating. What once seemed distant becomes intimate. Joel Goldsmith often said that every misunderstanding about God arises from the belief in two powers, one good, one evil, struggling for dominion. Fear thrives in this belief. But when the Christ is realized, you see that there is only one power, one presence, one life, one reality. In this recognition, fear dissolves. For what is there to fear when God alone is the substance of all being? This is why the second coming has been so misunderstood. People interpreted spiritual awakening through the lens of fear. They projected their own guilt, their own self-judgment, their own insecurity onto the idea of God's appearing. But God does not judge. God reveals. God does not condemn. God illumines. God does not destroy. God awakens. And so, beloved, let the fear of the second coming be dissolved once and for all in your heart. The only thing that disappears when Christ is revealed is that which never truly existed, the sense of separation, the false identity, the belief that you are alone in the universe. These are the illusions that fade, and what remains is peace that nothing in the world can disturb, because the peace that remains is the peace of your true self. When you understand this, you will no longer fear the coming of Christ. You will welcome it. For the Christ does not come to end your life. It comes to end your fear of life. It does not come to take anything from you. It comes to reveal what was always yours. It does not bring sorrow. It lifts the veil of sorrow. It does not bring judgment. It ends self-judgment. It does not bring the end of the world. It brings the end of suffering. This is why the second coming must be understood from within. For only within can fear dissolve, and only within can the Christ appear in its true nature. Let us rest in this recognition as we continue our journey. Beloved, if the second coming is not an external event, but the inner unveiling of Christ consciousness, then we must ask, how does one prepare for such a revelation? How does one make ready the temple of consciousness in which the Christ appears? And the answer, as simple and as profound as all spiritual truth, is this. We prepare by becoming still, not by effort, not by ritual, not by striving to attract the presence, but by ceasing the activity that hides it. The Christ appears not in noise, but in silence, not in movement, but in stillness, not in seeking, but in surrendering. For the divine presence does not approach the soul through the doorway of human effort. It reveals itself when human effort yields to the quiet awareness of what already is. Joel Goldsmith taught that true spiritual practice is not a reaching outward but a sinking inward, a gentle resting in the truth of one's own divine nature. And so, we do not prepare for the second coming by watching world events, by studying prophecies, or by attempting to discern signs in the heavens. We prepare by creating within ourselves an atmosphere receptive to revelation. This preparation looks like silence, not empty silence, but living silence. It looks like a few moments in which you release concern for outcomes, release personal striving, release the belief that you must accomplish something spiritually. It is the silence in which you say, not with words, but with awareness, "Here I am, Father. I am still. I am listening." You may sit quietly for a moment in the morning, not to ask, not to receive, not to get, but simply to recognize that God is here. You may rest for a moment before making a decision, acknowledging that divine wisdom is the guiding intelligence of your life. You may pause during the day, not to correct a problem, but to remember that in the presence of the Christ there are no problems, only appearances awaiting the dissolution of your belief in them. These moments of quiet recognition are the opening of the temple door. In the Old Testament, the temple was described as a sacred place where the presence of God dwelled. But the true temple is not a building, it is your consciousness. And it is only when the temple is quiet, only when the inner noise has fallen away, that the presence can be felt, heard, known. You cannot force the Christ to appear. You can only create an atmosphere in which recognition is possible. This is the essence of Goldsmith's teaching. Be still, not to bring God into your life, but to realize that God is your life. Rest, not to invite the Christ, but to see that the Christ has never left. The inner practice, then, is not a technique, but a posture of soul. It is the gentle remembrance that you are never separate from divine reality. It is the willingness to stop seeking God with the mind and begin sensing God with the heart. It is the humility to let go of your attempts to manage life and instead allow life to unfold from within. There may be times when you sit in silence and feel nothing. There may be days when the mind is busy, restless, unwilling to be still. This does not matter. The practice is not about achieving inner stillness. It is about returning to it. Even a moment of recognition begins the process of inner unveiling. For when the mind becomes quiet, even briefly, the soul begins to hear a different voice, a voice not of intellect, not of emotion, but of spirit. This voice does not speak in language. It speaks in peace. It speaks in assurance. It speaks in the quiet conviction that you are held, guided, sustained. And that peace, that assurance, is the earliest sign of Christ consciousness appearing. You do not need long hours of meditation to prepare the temple. You need a willingness to pause, to breathe, to rest inwardly, to release the tension of I must, to let the divine I am rise to the forefront of your awareness. As you cultivate these moments of inner realization, something begins to happen without your effort. The mind becomes more transparent. The heart becomes more receptive. The senses become less authoritative. The noise of the world loses its power to disturb you. And gradually, the presence that once seemed distant feels nearer, softer, more intimate. This is the preparation for the second coming, not outward activity, but inward receptivity. Not striving to draw the Christ to you, but recognizing the Christ already within the sanctuary of your being. Let us carry this understanding gently as we continue, for it leads directly into the next unfolding, how the inner Christ reveals itself through quiet transformation. Beloved, The second coming does not announce itself with explosions in the heavens or with the trembling of the earth. It does not tear through the fabric of nature, nor does it shake the foundations of the physical world. It comes softly, as every divine revelation comes through a quiet transformation of consciousness. And so we must learn to recognize the subtle signs, the gentle shifts, the inner movements that reveal the presence of Christ unfolding within us. For when the Christ begins to dawn in consciousness, nothing may change outwardly in the beginning. The world may look the same, the conditions may appear unchanged, but you are no longer the same observer. Something within you has shifted its center of gravity. Something in you has begun to see life not from the standpoint of a separate self, but from the presence of the infinite within. One of the first signs of this inner coming is a softening of fear. Fear does not vanish overnight, but it begins to lose its authority. The things that once terrified you no longer have the same power. You notice that you respond differently, not with panic, but with a quiet assurance that something greater than circumstance is present. This assurance is not psychological, it is not based on hope. It is the beginning of the Christ appearing, the inner sense that you are not alone and never have been. Another sign is the loosening of personal will. You no longer feel compelled to control every detail of life. You begin to see that life unfolds more harmoniously when you allow the divine rhythm to guide you. Decisions become clearer, not because you think more, but because you resist less. The Christ within does the guiding, the revealing, the adjusting, and you discover that yielding brings more peace than striving ever did. There is also the emergence of spontaneous peace, a peace not tied to circumstances, a peace that appears without reason. You may be in the midst of challenge, yet you feel an undercurrent of stillness, as though something in you is holding you above the waves. This peace is not created by the mind. It is not the result of affirmation or discipline. It is the natural atmosphere of Christ consciousness beginning to permeate your awareness. In the unfolding of the Christ, you may also notice that problems appear less solid, less threatening, less real. It is not that you deny them. It is not that you pretend they are not there. Rather, you perceive that behind every appearance is a divine reality untouched by the situation. You begin to see disease not as a power but as an appearance. You begin to see lack not as a condition but as a concept. You begin to see conflict not as truth but as misperception. And with this new vision, fear dissolves and harmony begins to emerge. Another unmistakable sign is the rise of compassion that is not of yourself. You find yourself more patient with others, not because you've tried to improve your character, but because you see through their behavior to the same divine self that lives in you. Judgment softens, criticism lifts. You begin to see the Christ in your neighbor, even when their behavior contradicts their true identity. This is the Christ seeing itself through you. Then there is the sense of inner guidance, which becomes more frequent, more natural. Not a voice, not an instruction in words, but a quiet knowing, a direction that arises from silence, not from analysis. You begin to trust this inner movement because you recognize that it does not come from personal thought. It comes from the presence that guides all life. This guidance leads you gently, often unexpectedly, yet always with perfect timing. And perhaps the most sacred sign of all is the diminishing of the sense of me. You begin to sense that the life you had long called your life is not personal but divine. You are not living life. Life is living you. You are not thinking thoughts. Thoughts arise in consciousness. You are not creating good. Good reveals itself through you. This subtle shift marks the beginning of the end of the false self, the beginning of the realization that your true identity is not a separate being at all, but the individualized expression of the One. These signs are not dramatic. They are not emotional. They are quiet transformations that unfold gently like dawn spreading across the horizon. The outer world may not notice at first, but you will know. And in time, others will see the fruits of this awakening not because you speak of it, but because you live from it. This is the second coming in its truest form, not the arrival of a figure in the sky, but the appearing of Christ's consciousness in the sanctuary of your soul. It is the dawning of truth where once there was ignorance, the blossoming of peace where once there was fear, the rising of love where once there was separation. And as this transformation continues, you discover something astonishing. The Christ you once sought as a future event has been the essence of your being all along. Let us carry these signs gently as we move deeper, for the next unfolding reveals how this inner appearing becomes the very atmosphere of daily life. Beloved, when the Christ has begun to unveil itself within you, when fear has softened, when peace has arisen without cause, when the inner guidance has become more real than human reasoning, then a profound shift takes place. You begin to live not as a seeker of God, but as one who abides in God. You begin to walk not toward the light, but in the light. And this quiet, continuous abiding is what it means to live in the ever-present Christ. It is not that you suddenly become perfect in the eyes of the world. It is not that every outer condition immediately reflects spiritual harmony. What changes first is not the world, but your center of being. You no longer stand in the consciousness of a separate self, reacting to circumstances. You stand in the awareness of the one presence, the one life, the one power. And from this center, life begins to unfold with a grace that is not of your doing. Joel Goldsmith often taught that the spiritual path is not about improving the human self, polishing it, perfecting it, or making it worthy. It is about seeing through the human self to the divine essence that has been there from the beginning. And as this recognition becomes more natural, your entire relationship with the world changes. You find that the events of life no longer disturb you as they once did. They may arise, they may pass, but they do not shake your inner foundation. Why? Because you no longer look to the outer world for stability. You have found your stability in the presence within. You no longer look to people for validation, to circumstances for safety, to possessions for security. You have discovered the secret the mystics have always known: the Christ within is the sufficiency of every need. You move through your days with a quiet confidence, not based on human ability, but on divine awareness. You listen more than you speak. You respond rather than react. You are guided not by impulses or fears, but by a subtle direction that comes from the stillness within. And as you live from this deeper center, harmony begins to express itself outwardly. Problems resolve without strain. Solutions appear before the mind has time to seek them. Opportunities come without effort. This is not magic. This is not manifestation. This is the natural activity of the Christ consciousness functioning as your life. There comes a point when you notice that the old sense of personal identity is fading. You no longer feel the need to defend yourself, prove yourself, or uplift yourself. You realize that the self you once tried to protect does not exist. The life living you is God life, and therefore needs no defense, no improvement, no protection. You discover what Jesus meant when he said, "Take no thought." To the personal mind, it sounds impossible, but to the awakened consciousness, it is the most natural way of being. Another sign of living in the ever-present Christ is the diminishing of inner conflict. Even when outward challenges arise, your inner atmosphere remains undisturbed. You feel a presence walking with you, speaking through you, thinking as you. You find yourself receiving insights, clarity, and peace without effort. You sense that everything is unfolding in divine order, even when appearances seem contrary. You trust not as belief, but as awareness. As this consciousness deepens, love begins to flow through you in ways you cannot explain. This love is not sentimental. It is not based on preference or personality. It is the natural radiance of the Christ. It flows toward those who love you and those who oppose you. It flows toward the stranger, the friend, the troubled, the joyful. You see that the same divine self lives in all, and so you cannot help but love because you perceive the one life looking back at you from every face. This love is not something you cultivate. It is something that reveals itself when the Christ is recognized. And this love heals not because you try to heal, but because healing is the natural activity of the realized presence. Living in the ever-present Christ also means that you begin to act without personal purpose. You no longer push life. You no longer try to make things happen. You simply allow yourself to be an instrument through which the divine can express. This is the essence of Christ living. The Father within me doeth the works. You discover that the works are done effortlessly when you step aside and let the presence function. And gradually, life becomes simpler. Not easier in the sense of escaping challenges, but simpler in the sense that you no longer divide your world into spiritual and material, sacred and ordinary, divine and human. You see the Christ everywhere. You feel the presence in all situations. You recognize that the kingdom of God is not a place but a state of awareness. You understand that heaven is not a future reward but the consciousness from which you live now. In this realization, you see that the second coming is not something that will happen. It is something that is happening now, always, eternally, whenever a soul awakens to the truth of its own identity. And living in the awareness of this truth, you cannot help but radiate peace, stability, compassion, and clarity. Not because you try, but because the Christ consciousness is the atmosphere of your being. This is the life Jesus lived. This is the life the mystics lived. This is the life Goldsmith pointed to, a life lived in the light of realization, a life where the outer world becomes the transparency through which the divine shines. And as this realization becomes steady, you begin to understand the true meaning of salvation, not deliverance from the world, but deliverance from the illusion of separation. Let us carry this awareness gently, for we now approach the final unfolding of this teaching. Beloved, as we come to the close of our time together, let us be very still for a moment. Let us rest in the awareness that nothing we have spoken of is a promise for the future, nor a prophecy waiting to unfold. It is a revelation of the eternal and unveiling of what has always been true, quietly awaiting your recognition. The second coming is not an event that sweeps across the sky. It is not a moment when the world will be startled into awakening. It is the dawning of truth within the heart, the recognition of the Christ as your very own identity, your very own life. It begins not with miracles, but with awareness. It begins not with the movement of the heavens, but with the stillness of your spirit. You have sought God through many paths, many teachings, many practices, but the Christ you have sought is the life within you, the presence that breathes you, the consciousness that sustains you. You have never been outside of it, not for a single moment. The only veil has been the belief that you are separate, the belief that God is elsewhere, the belief that salvation is a future event, and now that belief dissolves in the light of realization. The second coming begins the moment you turn inward and say, "Here, within me, is the presence of the living Christ," not as a theory, not as an affirmation, but as a quiet knowing. It begins when you stop seeking God as a power to influence your life and begin recognizing God as the very essence of your life. It begins when you rest not in human strength, not in human understanding, but in the divine eye that Jesus revealed and Goldsmith illuminated. From this moment on, let the Christ be the center of your awareness, not as a figure of history, but as the presence that is living you. Let this presence govern your actions, inspire your words, fill your silence, and guide your steps. Let it be the atmosphere in which you dwell, the peace in which you abide, the intelligence that directs your path. Do not be concerned with whether your realization is full or partial. Do not measure your progress. Do not analyze your experience. Do not judge your spiritual maturity. The Christ does not come through effort. It reveals itself through willingness. You have opened the door simply by listening, by contemplating, by letting these truths settle into the quiet places of your soul. The Christ does not wait for perfection. It shines wherever the heart is receptive. And so I say to you, the second coming begins in you now, not tomorrow, not after further study, not when life becomes easier, but here, in this instant, with this breath, in this awareness. You carry within you the same presence that animated Jesus, the same light that illumined the mystics, the same divine life that Joel Goldsmith recognized as the only reality. And as you walk in this awareness, even imperfectly, even tentatively, the world around you begins to feel your peace, your gentleness, your clarity. Others may not know what has awakened in you, but they will feel the atmosphere of Christ consciousness radiating from your presence. This, beloved, is how the second coming spreads, not through prophecy, but through realization, not through world events, but through awakened individuals, not through spectacle, but through inner transformation. You are the temple of the living God. You are the transparency for Christ. You are the place where God becomes visible. Let the realization unfold naturally, gently, silently. Let the Christ live through you, not by your effort, but by your surrender. And let your life become a quiet testament to the truth we have spoken. The Christ is here. The Christ is now. The Christ is you. Rest in this awareness. Abide in this peace. Walk in this light. And the second coming will continue to unfold, moment by moment, breath by breath, as the living presence of God expressing itself as your life.